At 4:40 on a February morning in Pittsburgh, a man in a black wool coat went down on a sheet of ice outside a 24-hour donut shop, and 3 people stood over him with their phones up. Sadie Kovacs was 29 years old. She'd been sleeping in a 2001 Buick behind a storage lot for more than a year, and the job she'd had for a couple of months was the only thing standing between her and another winter with nothing at all. She came out that door in a thin apron, dropped onto her knees on the ice, and started pushing on a stranger's chest. That's when her boss came out behind her. He didn't say a word about lawsuits. He looked at a black car parked across the street with its headlights off, and his voice changed. "Get up," he said. "You don't understand what's happening here." Sadie looked at the car for half a second. There was nobody in it. No driver, no passenger, doors shut, engine cold. She turned back to the man on the ground and kept counting out loud. Her boss pulled out his wallet, dropped 4 20s onto the ice beside her knee, and told her not to come back. She had both hands on a stranger's chest. She didn't have a free hand to pick the money up. She had only $212 to her name, and she'd just thrown away the only job she could get in this city, for a man whose name she didn't know. She had no idea who she'd just saved, and she had no idea that within a week, everything she believed about her own life was going to be turned upside down. If you're already leaning in, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss where this goes, and share it with somebody who needs to hear it. Now let's go back to that sidewalk and find out what this woman gave up. The ambulance pulled away, its siren fading toward the avenue, and all that remained on the sidewalk was a melted patch shaped like 2 knees where Sadie had been kneeling. She rose slowly, gripping the lamppost for support, because both legs below the knees had gone so numb that she couldn't feel the ground beneath her. She held her hands out in front of her and watched them tremble. She knew perfectly well it wasn't from the cold. The human body had its own way of collecting a debt after it had been forced to do something greater than it could bear. The delivery driver, who had been standing beside her all this time, remained silent, still holding the 4 bills he had picked up from the ice. He didn't say a word. He simply opened the pocket of her coat, slipped the money inside, zipped it shut, then gave her a single nod and walked back toward his truck. She didn't say anything either. There were moments when people understood one another without the need for words. One female paramedic lingered behind, holding a coil of electrode wire she hadn't had time to wind up. She studied Sadie for a moment, then asked where she had learned CPR. Because, she said, the man's chest showed signs that the compressions had been delivered at the proper depth, and most people on the street pressed far too shallowly. Sadie looked down at the sidewalk and said she used to do it for a living. The woman paused for half a beat, then repeated a single word. "Used to?" Sadie didn't answer. She merely pulled her collar higher and turned back toward the shop. Inside, the warmth struck her face like a slap, and dizziness swept over her. She went straight to the sink in the back, turned on the cold water, and washed her hands for a very long time, longer than necessary, until her fingertips turned red. She took off her apron, folded it, and placed it on the steel counter. Then she pulled her backpack from beneath the shelf. Inside was a bottle of water, a sweater, a hardbound notebook, and nothing else. She didn't take a single thing that didn't belong to her, not even the cup of coffee she had made for herself shortly before 4 o'clock that morning and hadn't managed to take one sip from. Ferris stood behind the counter with both hands resting on the glass, his eyes fixed on the cash register, as though something terribly important were happening inside it. He didn't look up. She passed within an arm's length of him, and he still didn't look up. She pushed open the door and stepped outside. She walked through 6 intersections before sitting down on a bench at a bus stop. She wasn't planning to go anywhere. She simply needed a place to sit without having to explain to anyone why she was sitting there. Dawn had begun to break, bringing with it the bleak, gray light of winter in that part of the country, and the first cars were moving along the road with their headlights still on. She sat motionless with both hands tucked into her pockets, and in one pocket were 4 bills she had never wanted. Her father had once worked at the steel mill down in Braddock. He was the quietest man she had ever known, but there was one thing he had repeated often enough that it remained inside her long after he was gone. He used to tell her that there were things in this world people did not, because they were paid to do them, and if you wanted to know how a person lived, all you had to do was look at those things. She had been too young then to understand what he meant. He died before she was old enough to ask him. She sat at the bus stop for about 40 minutes, then rose and walked toward the warehouse lot. The Buick was exactly where she had left it, covered in a thin layer of frost. She opened the door, climbed inside, and did what she had done every morning for more than a year. She started the engine, let it run for about 10 minutes so the warmth could slowly seep in, then shut it off, because gasoline was something she had to measure drop by drop. She took the stiff plastic card from the compartment and scraped away the thin layer of ice that had formed on the inside of the windshield, the kind everyone who slept in a car knew was created by their own breath through the night. Then she took the hardbound notebook from her backpack. That notebook had been with her since before she had this car. Inside were columns drawn by hand. Date, time in, time out, work completed, one line for every day, without a single day missing. She turned to a fresh page and wrote 2 words. Lost job. Then she sat looking at those 2 words for a while. After that, she added another line underneath in smaller handwriting, as though she were writing it for herself, rather than for anyone else to read, would still do exactly the same. She closed the notebook. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. The person on the other end was a hospital coordinator, speaking in the weary voice of someone nearing the end of a shift, asking if she was the woman who had performed CPR on the street outside the donut shop that morning. She said she was. The coordinator told her the patient had been stabilized, and the attending physician wanted her to know. Sadie sat in silence for several seconds, and the only question she asked wasn't about his name, his condition, or what would happen next. She asked whether anyone had come for him. There was a pause on the other end, one that lasted a little too long, longer than it normally should have. Then the coordinator said yes. More people than usual. On the top floor of a hospital east of the city, there was a corridor where nurses had to swipe their badges twice to gain entry, and along that corridor stood only a handful of doors. That night, 2 men remained outside one of those doors from before dawn, never leaning against the wall, never sitting in a chair, never speaking to each other. The nurses continued going about their work, but every one of them slowed down slightly whenever they passed that spot. Near noon, Cormac Fallon opened his eyes. He lay still for about half a minute, staring at the ceiling, allowing his body to report its condition to him one part at a time, in the manner of a man accustomed to examining himself before permitting anyone else to examine him. Then he turned his head to one side. There were 4 people in the room. The first thing he asked wasn't what had happened. It wasn't where he was. It wasn't how long he had been lying there. He asked who had knelt down. No one could answer. One of them opened his mouth as if to say something about the doctor, then thought better of it. Cormac didn't repeat himself immediately. He waited. He allowed the silence to stretch for precisely as long as necessary, and within that silence, every person standing in the room understood that they had just been asked a question for which they had no answer. Then he asked a second time in exactly the same voice, no louder, no slower, without adding a single word. The entire room fell silent. Niall Brennan stood at the foot of the bed with both hands clasped behind his back. He told Cormac to lie down. It was the only thing said in that room that wasn't an answer to the question, and it was also the only thing Cormac ignored completely without making the speaker pay for it. By the following afternoon, Cormac had signed his discharge papers. The doctor told him he needed to remain in the hospital at least through the weekend, that a man who had just been through something like that shouldn't remain on his feet for long, shouldn't travel far, and shouldn't force his heart to work under pressure. Cormac listened to every word, thanked her with a brief and courteous sentence, then signed his name. He walked out of the hospital on his own 2 feet. That evening, in the back room of a restaurant on Penn Street, several men had been waiting since daylight. Food had been laid out on the table hours earlier and had gone cold, but no one had touched it. Some sat with their backs straight, while others turned glasses of water in their hands without drinking. The door opened. Cormac entered, removed his coat, and every man seated at the table rose at the same moment. He didn't look at anyone. He simply walked to his chair and sat down. Only after he was seated did the others sit. The first man permitted to speak was in his 50s, his hands resting on the table, his fingers digging into the edge of the wood. He asked for an extension on a payment, and he spoke at length, his voice repeatedly faltering, because people often spoke too much when they were afraid. He told Cormac about the store, about the winter, about the people who still owed him money he couldn't collect. Cormac listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt once. When the man finally stopped, Cormac looked at him for about 2 seconds and said 3 words. Give him time. The man fell silent, then lowered his head very quickly, and those seated beside him politely looked away because they had all seen his shoulders tremble once. The second man was different. This man had lied to Cormac about a shipment, and everyone at the table knew it, just as the man himself knew that everyone at the table knew. He began to explain. Cormac allowed him to speak for about a minute, then quietly raised one hand, lifting only 2 fingers, and the man stopped at once. Cormac didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike the table. He didn't stand. He merely asked how the shop down in Carrick had been doing lately. The one on the corner. The one it had taken the man more than 10 years to build. He asked in the calmest voice imaginable, the voice of a man inquiring about the weather. Then he didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the man beside him and began discussing something entirely different, the permit for a warehouse by the river, and the conversation continued as though the question had never been asked. The man remained in his chair for a very long time afterward. He didn't touch the food. He didn't dare stand, even when the others began to leave, because standing meant walking past the place where Cormac sat, and he hadn't been given permission to do that. Near midnight, when only 2 men remained in the room, Niall closed the door and stood there with his hands still clasped behind his back, waiting. Cormac looked at the plate of cold food before him without touching it. Then he raised his eyes and asked the exact same question he had asked at the hospital. While the men in the back room of the restaurant on Penn Street were beginning to search for a name, on the other side of the city, the woman who carried that name was submitting job applications. For 6 days in a row, Sadie did the same thing every morning. She woke while it was still dark, drove somewhere with running water so she could wash her face, then sat in the public library until closing time, filling out one application after another. She applied to 2 restaurants, a grocery store, an industrial laundry, a bakery on the north side, a private nursing home, and 3 other places whose names she couldn't even remember. No one called her back. She knew why, and knowing was worse than not knowing. Her nursing license remained intact. No one had taken it away. On paper, she was still a trained professional. Her name was still listed in the state registry, her fees fully paid, her required training hours complete. But beside her name, in the notes column, there was one short line about an unresolved incident involving a patient's property. That was all. No conviction. No disciplinary action. Not a single word explaining what she had done. But anyone who opened that registry and typed in her name saw that line before they saw anything else about her. And no facility in the world would hire someone with a line like that beside her name when hundreds of spotless applications were waiting. Legally, she still had a profession. In reality, she wasn't allowed to practice it. That line bore no one's signature. There was no name identifying the person who had entered it. No one was responsible for it, and for that very reason, no one had the authority to remove it. She had called to ask about it many times during the first few years. They transferred her from one department to another. Everyone was polite. Everyone said it wasn't their department, and in the end, the call always led to a voicemail box. No one ever checked. On the 6th day, she drove to a women's shelter on the south side. She didn't like going there, but the temperature had fallen lower than she had expected the night before, and she had awakened close to 3 o'clock because of the cold, not because of her alarm. The woman on duty had silver hair and sat behind a glass partition, her eyes still fixed on the screen when Sadie entered. After listening to her, the woman shook her head and said they were full, and that she should come back Tuesday. She said it in the voice of someone who had repeated those words too many times to hear what they meant anymore. A weightless voice that held neither cruelty nor compassion, merely a sound uttered because the moment had come to utter it. Sadie thanked her. Then she went outside and stood by the door. Darkness was settling in, the swift kind of darkness that came with winter in that part of the country, and the streetlights flickered on one by one. She stood there for several minutes with her hands in her pockets, and there was no sadness in her mind at all. There was only a calculation. Where the fuel gauge stood. How many times she would need to start the engine each night to keep from waking up because of the cold. With the money she had left, not counting the 4 bills in her coat pocket that she still hadn't touched, how many nights remained before she would be forced to choose between gasoline and something to eat? She worked out the number in her head. Then she walked toward the car. The laundromat on Penn Street stayed open all night, and that was why Sadie was there close to midnight the following day. She had 2 shirts. That was everything she owned apart from the one she was wearing, and she had postponed washing them longer than she should have, because every wash meant feeding more coins into a machine. No one else was in the laundromat. There was only the steady turning of the drum, the hiss of the pipes each time the machine changed cycles, and the smell of cheap detergent that had seeped into the walls over the course of several decades. She sat in a plastic chair near the window with her arms folded across her chest, watching the drum revolve without truly seeing it. Then headlights swept across the glass. A black car pulled up beside the curb outside, stopped across 2 parking spaces, and left its engine running. It remained there, idling softly, white exhaust rising behind it into the cold air. Another car looking for a place to park slowed down, looked, then continued on without sounding its horn. The laundromat door opened. The man entered alone. He wore a black wool coat with the buttons undone, and when he reached out to push the door, his sleeve slipped back, revealing a small bandage on the back of his hand where an intravenous needle had been inserted. Sadie recognized him immediately, not because of his face, but because of the way he stood, the way he occupied space in a room without having to do anything at all. He didn't approach her right away. He stood near the center of the laundromat, several steps away, and studied her for a moment. "You're Sadie Kovacs," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't stand. She told him he didn't need to come there and that she didn't need his money. He nodded very slowly, as though she had said precisely what he had expected to hear. "If you did," he said, "I wouldn't have come." She looked at him. "Who are you?" He was silent for about 3 seconds. 3 seconds in a room filled with nothing but the sound of a washing machine lasted longer than most people imagined. "If you went outside and asked the people around here," he said, "they would answer by changing the subject." She didn't ask again. Some answers didn't become any clearer when more questions were asked. They only made the person asking them more uncomfortable. He pulled out a plastic chair and sat down, not directly across from her, but slightly to one side, leaving just enough distance between them. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Sadie felt her entire body tense slightly, the reflex of someone who had grown too accustomed to people offering her things she didn't want to accept. But what he took out wasn't a wallet. It was a piece of paper folded into quarters. He placed it on the folding table between them and gently pushed it toward her. "A bakery down in the Strip District," he said. "The owner's name is Ruth Ostrowski. 6 o'clock Thursday morning. She'll speak with you." Sadie looked at the paper but didn't pick it up. "You already told her to hire me, didn't you?" "No." "Why not?" She heard the sharpness in her voice, sharper than she had intended, but she didn't take it back. "You could do it. I can tell just by looking at you that you could. It would only take 1 phone call." "So why didn't you?" He didn't answer immediately. He watched the washing machine turn, the 2 shirts tumbling over and over inside. "Because if I did," he said, "then 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you would still lie awake at night wondering whether you had deserved that job. You would never know for certain, and you would carry that question with you for the rest of your life." He turned and looked at her. "People have already taken a great many things from you. I don't intend to take anything else." Sadie sat motionless. Something inside her chest had just shifted, ever so slightly, and she didn't know what to call it. She had prepared herself to resist pity. She had prepared herself to refuse money. She hadn't prepared for someone to see the precise place inside her that hurt most, and speak it aloud in the calm voice of a man discussing the weather. "Does she know what happened to me?" she asked. "She knows you're coming. The rest is between you and her." He stood. He rose slowly, bracing one hand against the side of the chair, and in that moment, Sadie could clearly see that he was still a man who had left the hospital too soon. He fastened one button on his coat. 6 o'clock, he said. "Don't be late. She doesn't like that." Then he walked out. The door closed behind him. The black car outside moved forward, its red taillights glowing for a moment at the end of the street before disappearing. Sadie remained alone beneath the fluorescent lights. The washing machine entered its spin cycle, shuddered, then fell silent. She reached out, picked up the piece of paper, unfolded it, and looked at the handwritten line inside. On Wednesday night, in the Buick behind the warehouse lot, Sadie lay curled across the back seat with her sweater draped over her shoulders and the piece of paper resting on her stomach. She had stared at it all day. She had unfolded and refolded it so many times that the creases were beginning to wear thin. And strangely, the closer Thursday morning came, the more frightened she became, not the more hopeful. People often believed that someone in desperate circumstances would seize any opportunity that appeared. The truth was the opposite. Desperate people feared opportunity more than anyone else because they had learned that the price of a broken hope was greater than the price of having no hope at all. Sadie lay there and thought about it in very specific terms. without the slightest trace of vagueness. Every time she allowed herself to want something, she lost it. It was as though someone were sitting somewhere, keeping a record, and the simple act of wanting was what told them what to take from her next. She thought of the man she had once married. He had injured his back at work, and at first, the medication had only been something to help him endure his shift, then something to help him sleep, then something to help him get out of bed. She had believed it would pass because people always believed that in the beginning. She worked the night shift, then came home and cooked. She picked up every pill that fell onto the bathroom floor and said nothing. She signed the papers he put in front of her without reading them carefully, because reading them carefully would have meant that she didn't trust him. And she had promised herself that she would. Only later did someone explain to her that those loans, those cards, all of them had been opened in her name. Then one morning, she came home from work, opened the closet, and found it empty. There was no letter. There was nothing at all. Only a few clothes hangers still swaying. The pain wasn't that he had left. The pain was standing there and realizing that everything she had believed through all those years had been something she had created inside her own mind. Lying in the car, Sadie picked up the piece of paper and held it between two fingers. One small pull would be enough. Tomorrow morning, she wouldn't have to walk into an unfamiliar room and let someone look her over from head to toe. She wouldn't have to tell the old story again. She wouldn't have to watch someone's expression change when she reached that part. She could return to precisely where she was now. And although this place was terrible, she already knew its shape. She held the paper that way for a long time. What stopped her hand wasn't hope. She had run out of hope a long time ago. Hope was a luxury for people who still had strength to spare. What stopped her was another memory, the memory of how many times she had already run away, and how each time she ran, the circle in which she stood grew a little smaller. She put the paper down. Then she sat up, turned on the light from her phone, took out her notebook, and opened it to a fresh page. She wrote one line, her handwriting trembling slightly from the cold. "Being careful keeps me safe." Then she wrote a second line directly beneath it. "Being too careful keeps me standing still." She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and lay down. She set her alarm for 4:30, far earlier than necessary, because she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep, and she would rather wake early than lie waiting in the darkness. Sadie had been standing outside the bakery since before there was any light in the sky, more than half an hour before the appointed time, both hands tucked into her pockets, as she looked at the faded lettering painted across the glass. The lights inside had been on for a long time. The smell of sourdough and the heat of the ovens slipped through the narrow gap beneath the door and drifted into the cold street air. The kind of smell that made anyone passing by slow down slightly without knowing why. At exactly 6 o'clock, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, short and broad-shouldered, with her hair pulled back by a stretched elastic band. Both arms, from the wrists to the elbows, were covered with old burn scars, the kind only someone who had spent decades working beside an oven would have. She looked Sadie over from head to toe exactly once. Quickly, the way someone might glance at a sack of flour to see whether it had torn anywhere. Sadie held out her hand. Ruth Ostrowski didn't take it. She merely tipped her chin toward the sink in the corner of the kitchen. "Wash your hands," she said. "Warm water. Don't use the blue soap. It smells." Sadie went to the sink. She washed her hands thoroughly, rolled up her sleeves, and dried them with the cloth towel hanging nearby. When she turned around, Ruth had already pulled a large covered aluminum tray from the proofing room and placed it on the steel table between them. She lifted the cloth. Beneath it was a mass of dough that had risen overnight, its surface smooth and taut, slightly swollen in the center. Ruth pushed the entire tray toward Sadie. "Touch it," she said. "Tell me what it needs." Sadie looked at the dough. She had never baked bread in her life. She was about to say so, and had already opened her mouth. But then she saw the way the older woman stood, with both hands braced against the edge of the table, neither hurrying her nor offering any further explanation, and she understood that this wasn't a question about baking. She placed her entire hand against the surface of the dough. In that moment, something in her hand began to work automatically, without waiting for her command. For so many years, every night, she had placed her hands against people's wrists, their foreheads, and their backs as she turned them, and her hands had learned to read what the eyes couldn't see. Temperature revealed what was happening inside. The tension beneath the skin revealed whether a body was holding on or letting go. She kept her hand there for about 10 seconds. Then she spoke. "It's warmer than it should be," she said. "The center is warmer than the edges. Someone left it too close to the oven, or somewhere hot air was blowing across one side." She gently pressed one finger into it, then lifted her hand and watched the indentation slowly fill again. "And it hasn't rested long enough. It wants more time, but someone is making it get up too early." She withdrew her hand, wiped it on the cloth apron hanging from the edge of the table, and looked up. Ruth Ostrowski said nothing. She looked at Sadie. She looked for a very long time, longer than one person could normally stare at another without growing uncomfortable. Long enough for Sadie to hear the oven behind them switch itself on, and then off again. There was nothing warm in her gaze, but there was nothing harsh in it either. It was simply the gaze of someone comparing what she had just heard with something inside her own mind, and having no intention of revealing the result. Then she reached out and carefully drew the cloth back over the tray of dough, smoothing all 4 edges. She lifted the tray and set it aside on the table. With the toe of her shoe, she pulled out a wooden chair and pushed it toward Sadie. Then she pulled out another chair for herself and sat opposite her, resting her scarred hands in her lap. "Sit down," she said. Sadie sat. Behind Ruth, beyond the glass window, the street was beginning to brighten, and a delivery truck passed slowly with its headlights still on. No one in the kitchen said anything for a while. Then Ruth Ostrowski asked her the first question, and it was the one Sadie had feared since the night before. "How many years did you work as a nurse before you stopped?" Ruth asked. "Why did you stop?" The question fell cleanly between them, without a single word to soften its arrival. Sadie had imagined this moment throughout the previous night, and in every version she had rehearsed, she began by explaining the circumstances before describing what had happened. But sitting here before this woman, she understood that doing so would be like walking around a hole and then telling someone the hole wasn't there. So she told the story plainly. She said an elderly woman in her care had lost her wedding ring. She said the woman had worn it for nearly an entire lifetime, but that day it was no longer on her finger, nor was it in the little dish on the bedside cabinet where she placed it every night. She said they searched the entire room, the bed, and the laundry basket, but couldn't find it. She said she had worked the previous night shift, that she had entered the room more often than anyone else, and that she was the only person on that shift who hadn't been there for more than a few years. She said the meeting took place in a small room and lasted a little over 10 minutes, and during those minutes, no one said the word everyone in the room was thinking. They used other words. They said a different direction was needed. They said it was only while the matter was being clarified. They thanked her for the years she had devoted to the facility, then escorted her to the door. She said the police never called her afterward. There was no trial. No one ever accused her of anything. There was only a line entered into her record on the state registry, and from that day forward, no one called her back. She told the entire story without adding a single sentence in her own defense, without lowering her voice at any point to ask for sympathy. When she finished, only the sound of the oven remained in the kitchen. Ruth Ostrowski asked her one question. "Did you take it?" "No," Sadie said. Ruth gave a very slight nod. "I have no way of knowing whether that's true." "I know," Sadie said, "and I have no way to prove it. If I did, I wouldn't be sitting here." Ruth looked at her. Then she stood, walked to the tray of dough, lifted the cloth, and pulled the tray toward Sadie's end of the table. "Then neither of us knows," she said. 4 o'clock tomorrow morning. The wages are reported, and the insurance is paid. I don't do business any other way. There's a room upstairs that used to be for storage. It has a bed and a sink. If you stay there, I'll deduct a little from your wages. Only a little, just enough so it doesn't become charity." Sadie sat motionless. She could hear her own heart. "You haven't asked whether I know how to bake," she said. "I already did," Ruth replied, tipping her chin toward the tray of dough. "And you already answered." She went into the back, returned with a clean apron, folded it, and placed it on the table in front of Sadie. Then she stood there with her hands on her hips, gazing through the window, and added one more sentence in the casual voice of someone mentioning something that didn't matter very much. "The man who sent you here?" she said. "I've known him since he was shorter than that oven. I sold bread to his mother all those years. She bought 2 loaves every morning and 3 on Saturdays." She fell silent for a moment. "In all the years since, he has never asked me for anything. Not once." She turned and looked at Sadie. "Until today." Sadie opened her mouth. Ruth raised one hand. "Don't thank me," she said. "I hate that." 4 o'clock. Back door. Sadie took the apron and walked out, and she moved perfectly normally until she was inside her car and had closed the door. Then she sat there. She didn't cry. She simply placed both hands on the steering wheel, lowered her head between her arms, and breathed. She breathed like someone who had just been pulled from beneath the surface of the water, each breath long and trembling, without a sound. She remained that way for about 10 minutes, until her breathing became steady again. Then she lifted her head, started the engine, and drove away. The room upstairs had an iron bed, a sink, a window overlooking the sheet metal roof of the building next door, and a bare light bulb hanging from the center of the ceiling. On her first night, Sadie lay down, turned off the light, and remained still for a very long time. She listened to the pipes inside the wall, the sound of a car passing on the street below, and the oven vent downstairs starting up from time to time. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. It had been a very long time since she had lain beneath a ceiling that was her own. The ceilings at the shelter belonged to someone else. The ceilings in the places where she had stayed for a few nights during that first year had belonged to someone else as well. And what she had stared at for more than a year wasn't a ceiling at all. It was the faded fabric lining of an old car, exactly an arm's length above her face. She lay there looking at her own ceiling, unable to think of anything. Then she fell asleep, and she slept without waking until her alarm sounded. 4 weeks passed according to a rhythm she had never known in her life. She rose at 3 o'clock in the morning, went down to the kitchen, and for the entire morning, there were only 4 things: the oven, the dough, the salt, and time. Ruth taught her how to read the starter and how to listen for the crust cracking when a loaf first came out of the oven. That faint little crackling sound she called the bread singing. She taught her that dough obeyed no one. It only responded to the way it was treated, and if someone rushed it even slightly, it knew at once. She never praised Sadie. Not once. But by the end of the 2nd week, she began allowing her to oversee the first batch of the day alone. By the 3rd week, she gave her a key to the back door. By the 4th, she no longer stood beside her and watched. She went out front to do her own work and left the entire kitchen in Sadie's hands. That was how Ruth spoke. Sadie understood this one morning when Ruth passed by, glanced at the tray of bread Sadie had just removed from the oven, said nothing, and placed a worn old recipe notebook that she always kept in a private drawer on the table beside her. She didn't say Sadie was allowed to read it. She simply set it down and walked away. Sadie began to sleep again. It was the change she noticed last, because people didn't notice when they were sleeping. They noticed only when they couldn't sleep. She ate 3 meals a day. She ate breakfast standing beside the oven, lunch seated at the small table in the back, and dinner, which was usually leftover bread with reheated soup. Her clothes began to fit properly again. Then one day, when a familiar old man came in and complained that the bread was darker than it had been the day before, she heard herself laugh and say something back to him. It wasn't until he had walked out the door that she froze, realizing she had just laughed with a stranger. She stood there with the bread tongs still in her hand, and it took her a moment to remember the last time she had done that. It had been during that winter, the winter when she lost her mother, and then, immediately afterward, lost one more thing she had never spoken aloud to anyone. During the 4th week, on a morning as ordinary as any other, a man entered the bakery. He was about 40, wore a dark coat, and waited in line like everyone else without saying a word. When his turn came, he bought a loaf of brown bread, paid in cash, and didn't take his change. Then he leaned toward Ruth and spoke very quietly. One short sentence, only a few words. Ruth's reply was even shorter. She didn't look up, and her hands continued placing bread into a paper bag for the next customer. The man nodded once and walked out. Sadie watched him through the window. He didn't open the bag. He simply carried it at his side, walked to the end of the street, and disappeared around the corner. "Who was that?" she asked. "No one," Ruth said. She finished packing the bread, handed the bag to the customer, accepted the money, and counted out the change. Then she added one more sentence without looking at Sadie, her eyes still on the cash drawer. "Every morning, someone comes in to buy bread and doesn't eat it." The first person to call her was a reporter from the local newspaper named Hal Merrick, whose voice had been made hoarse by years of smoking and spending all day on the telephone. He said he was looking into her former workplace. Sadie told him she had nothing to say and hung up. 3 days later, he called again. He said he had spoken with 4 people who had once worked for Dale Ferris, and 3 of the 4 were too afraid to let him record them. Sadie told him she had nothing to say, and hung up a second time. On the 3rd call, He didn't mention the article. He merely said that he didn't care whether she agreed to speak with him, but he wanted her to know something. Of all the people he had met, one man had worked there for nearly 4 years and had never once been paid for the full number of hours he had worked, and that man had just told him to forget it because lawsuits never changed anything. Sadie remained silent on the other end of the line for a very long time. Then she agreed to meet him the following morning at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the bakery, and she stated her conditions before he had time to open his notebook. She said she would talk about wages, hours, and things that could be verified. She wouldn't say a single word about what had happened that morning. She wouldn't say a single word about the man. If Merrick asked, she would stand up and leave. Merrick studied her for a moment, then nodded and said he accepted. She placed the hardbound notebook on the table and opened it. He bent over it, turned several pages, then began turning them more slowly. He looked up at her, then lowered his eyes and continued. Ferris's method wasn't complicated. He reported a portion of the hours to make everything appear legitimate, enough to produce a payroll record, enough for anyone looking at it to see an ordinary business. The remaining hours, the ones people actually spent standing in the kitchen, scrubbing floors, and stocking shelves, he paid by hand, in cash, at whatever rate he chose. On paper, a person might work 30 hours a week. In reality, that person worked far more. Between those two numbers was a gap, and that gap was where Ferris made his living. In Sadie's notebook, every day had its own line, with the time she arrived, the time she left, and the work she performed, all written by hand in blue ink, without a single day missing from the moment she first stepped into that place. That was precisely what measured the gap. Merrick asked why she had kept the records. She told him she had been cheated once before, a long time ago, and after someone had been cheated once, keeping records simply became a habit. The article was published on a Tuesday morning. Sadie read it between 2 batches of bread, standing beside the scale with flour still clinging to her hands. Most of the article concerned working hours and payroll records, the 4 other employees, and the amount estimated by a labor attorney. Near the end, a short paragraph stated that the reporter had contacted the owner for comment. Dale Ferris gave exactly 1 sentence in response. He said people should find out why she had been forced to leave the nursing home before believing the word of someone who had once been suspected of stealing from a patient. Sadie read the sentence twice. Then she placed her phone face down on the scale, brushed off her hands, and returned to the batch of bread waiting for her. She worked through the rest of the morning exactly as she did every morning. She didn't tell anyone. At the end of the day, after the doors had been closed and she was wiping down the steel table, Ruth passed by, stopped, and placed a cup of coffee beside her. "Do you want to respond?" she asked. "No," Sadie said. Ruth nodded once. "Good." Then she went into the back and turned off the lights. 4 nights after the article was published, Sadie woke close to 3 o'clock in the morning because a cold draft was blowing across her face. She lay still for several seconds, the old reflex of someone accustomed to sleeping in places that didn't belong to her, listening with her ears before opening her eyes. There was no sound of anyone in the room. She sat up and turned on the light. The door stood wide open. She remembered perfectly well that she had closed it the night before because she always closed it. The only drawer in the small cabinet had been pulled out as far as it would go and hung suspended from the frame, its contents scattered across the floor. Her backpack had been turned upside down, its bottom facing upward. The mattress had been lifted and dropped back into place unevenly. The window overlooking the sheet metal roof was slightly open, and the wind was coming through it. She remained seated on the edge of the bed for a long time before standing. Then she went downstairs. The cash box beneath the counter was still locked and untouched. She opened it and counted the money. Nothing was missing. The dough mixer was still where it belonged. The digital scale was still where it belonged, and the knives still hung from the rack. The back door was locked from the inside. The front door was locked from the inside. Nothing had been forced. Nothing had been broken. There wasn't a single scratch. She went back upstairs, stood in the middle of the room, and began picking up each item and returning it to its place, slowly and methodically. Her sweater, the bottle of water, the cold medicine, the recipe notebook Ruth had given her, the plastic wallet, her identification papers. She continued for nearly 15 minutes. At last, when everything had been restored to its proper place, she straightened and looked around. And she realized that only one thing was missing from everything she had just put away. The hardbound notebook. She looked at the empty drawer. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, and two realizations came to her at once, with neither one arriving before the other. The first was that someone knew where she slept, not merely where she worked, because anyone in the city who had read the newspaper knew where she worked. Someone knew which room was hers upstairs, which window opened onto the sheet metal roof, and which nights she slept alone in this building. The second was that someone knew exactly how valuable that notebook was. This hadn't been a common thief. A common thief would have taken the cash box. A common thief wouldn't have climbed across a sheet metal roof in the middle of the night, searched a room containing nothing of value, then left without touching a single dollar. This person knew there was something inside the building, and this person knew exactly where to find it. Sadie sat there with her bare feet resting on the cold wooden floor, and she allowed the fear to pass through her body once, from her head to her feet, the way someone allowed a gust of wind to pass, rather than trying to stop it. Then it passed, and once it was gone, she reached for the phone on the windowsill. She opened her email account. In the search bar, she typed 2 words, her own name. The messages appeared in a long line, each one sent from her to herself, once every week without fail, every Sunday night throughout the entire time she had worked there. Each message contained several photographs, pictures of every page, taken at a slight angle with her phone beneath the yellow light inside the car, some of them even showing the edge of the steering wheel. Every line was there, the date, the time she arrived, the time she left, the work she performed, all in blue ink and in her own handwriting. She scrolled down, then kept scrolling, and the messages continued appearing without end. She hadn't done it because she was clever. She had never imagined that the day would come when she might need them. She had done it because once in her life, she had signed things she hadn't read carefully, and after someone had been cheated once, they never again kept only one copy of anything. She lowered the phone into her lap, raised her eyes to the window that remained slightly open, and sat that way until her alarm sounded. He came close to 7 o'clock that evening, after Ruth had gone home, and Sadie was finishing wiping down the steel table. She heard the front door open, heard the little brass bell on the frame ring once, and looked up. Cormac Fallon stood there holding a newspaper folded in half. He didn't greet her. He walked to the counter, placed the newspaper on the glass, and turned it around so she could read it, even though they both knew she already had. "Do you want this to end?" he asked. Sadie set down the cloth. She was about to answer when the phone in his coat pocket vibrated. He looked at the screen. Then he did something she would think about many times afterward. He didn't apologize. He didn't turn away. He didn't step outside or retreat into a corner of the room. He raised the phone to his ear and listened right where he stood, exactly 1 counter's width from her, his eyes still fixed directly on her. She could hear the man speaking on the other end, not the words themselves, only the rhythm, the hurried rhythm of someone trying to explain something he knew couldn't be explained. Cormac allowed him to speak. Then he said 3 things. First, he said he had known before the man called. Second, he said that beginning tomorrow morning, the man no longer needed to report to the docks, and by noon, every other place in the city would know they no longer needed him either. Third, he said there wouldn't be a second conversation. His voice didn't rise in the slightest. It didn't quicken or slow. He didn't use a single vulgar word. He delivered those 3 sentences in precisely the same voice he had just used to ask Sadie whether she wanted this to end. Then he lowered the phone, turned it off, and placed it face down on the glass counter. "As I was saying," he continued, "do you want this to end?" Sadie sat down in the wooden chair behind the counter. She didn't answer his question. "What did that man just lose?" she asked. Cormac looked at her. He didn't seem surprised by the question, nor did he appear annoyed. "His work," he said, "and nearly 20 years of connections. He started working for us when he was younger than you are now." "For what?" "Because he thought that while I was in the hospital, I wouldn't know." In the kitchen behind them, the oven vent switched itself on, and then off again. Sadie looked at the phone lying face down on the glass. She thought of that man, someone she would never meet, standing somewhere in the city with the phone still in his hand, beginning to understand what had just happened to his life, in less time than it took for a song to play. "You said it so easily," she said. Cormac didn't answer immediately. He looked at her for a long time, with the gaze of someone who felt no discomfort in remaining silent before another person. "You saved a man on the ice," he finally said. "You had never met him before. You didn't know his name, what he did, or what he had done through all those years to earn the position he held. He placed one hand on the counter. You saved a person. You didn't save a story. Don't confuse the two, Miss Kovacs. If you do, you'll be the one who pays for it later. Sadie raised her eyes and looked directly at him. She had been afraid of him when they first met at the laundromat, the vague fear of someone standing near something she didn't understand. Now there was nothing vague about it, and strangely, she wasn't any more afraid. I'm not confused, she said. I know exactly whom I saved. I've known since that morning, from the moment my employer looked out at the street and changed his tone of voice. I didn't need anyone to explain it to me. She stood, picked up the cloth, and wiped away the last mark on the steel table. What I haven't decided, she said, isn't whom I saved. She hung the cloth on its hook. It's whether I regret it. Cormac stood motionless. For one brief moment, something passed across his face. It wasn't anger or offense, but the expression of a man who had just heard something no one had dared say to him in a very long time. Then it was gone. He picked up his phone and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. Then take your time deciding, he said. My question will remain. He picked up the newspaper, folded it again, and left it on the counter. Then he walked out, and the brass bell on the doorframe rang once behind him. He returned the following evening at the same hour, and this time Sadie was already standing behind the counter, as though she had known he would come. He stood on the other side of the glass without sitting down. Yesterday's question, he said. I'm asking it again. Do you want this to end? What are you planning to do? That place rents its building from someone I know. He has 3 suppliers, and I know all 3. His retail license has to be renewed this summer. He recited those facts in the voice of someone reading a grocery list. One afternoon, by the end of the month, there won't be a shop left to talk about. Sadie was silent for a moment. No, she said. He didn't ask again. He simply waited. Do you know what it feels like to stand in a room and listen to people decide your life without being allowed to say a single word? She asked. I do. I stood in a room like that. Then I stood outside the doors of one place after another. And every time, someone sat behind a desk somewhere, looked at my name on a screen, and made the decision for me. Through all those years, not once was I the one who got to decide. She placed both hands on the counter. If you do this now, it will be one more person deciding for me. The only difference is that this time, the decision would benefit me. But it would still be the same thing. Cormac nodded once, very slowly. He reached inside his coat, and this time, he removed a thin file held together with a paper clip, only a few pages thick. He placed it on the glass and pushed it toward her. Then something else, he said. Sadie opened it. The first page was a printout from the state registry system. Her name, the date her license had been issued, and that line in the notes section, printed in black ink on white paper, short and stark, resting there like a nail driven into a wall. The second page contained a list of names and titles, none of which she recognized. That line has no signature, Cormac said. No one is responsible for it, which means no one has the standing to defend it either. I need 1 week. By next Thursday, when you type your name into that registry, it will be clean. Sadie looked at the paper. She looked at it for a very long time. This was the thing that had taken from her, the profession she loved, the years that followed, a place to sleep, and even the right to have people look her directly in the face without suspicion. She had called about it until she had no hope left. And now a man stood one glass counter away, telling her it would take 1 week. She closed the file and pushed it back toward him. No, she said. He didn't move. If it disappears that way, she said, then I'm still a thief. I'll simply be a thief with someone protecting me. She pushed the file a little farther until it rested entirely on his side of the counter. I don't need that line to disappear. I need it to be proven wrong. Those aren't the same thing, and you know perfectly well they aren't. The bakery was very quiet. The refrigerator in the back started running, then switched off again. Cormac stood there with one hand resting lightly on the file, and he said nothing for so long that Sadie heard a car pass on the street outside, then another. Only later would she understand why the silence had lasted so long. He hadn't been trying to think of a way to persuade her. It was simply that, in all those years, no one had ever refused him twice in the same evening. Let me ask you something, she said. Do you do bad things? He didn't look away. He didn't make a joke to avoid answering. He didn't offer explanations about his circumstances, or say that this was simply the way the world worked. Yes, he said. I'm not a good man, Miss Kovacs, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend that I am. I'm only trying, each day, not to be worse than I was the day before. Some days I succeed, some days I don't. He picked up the file and slipped it back inside his coat. That is everything I can promise you. If it isn't enough, I understand. I didn't ask you to promise me anything, Sadie said. I only wanted to hear you tell the truth once. He looked at her for one more moment, then walked out, and the brass bell on the doorframe rang once. It went on for more than 2 weeks, and Cormac knew nothing about it until a landlord called him to make certain. The donut shop on that street that stayed open all night had suddenly stopped receiving deliveries. The flour supplier said there was no stock available. The coffee supplier said the credit limit needed to be reviewed. Then the landlord received a very polite telephone call, reminding him that the lease was nearing renewal, and that perhaps he ought to reconsider. No one threatened anyone. There was no need. In this city, when all those things happened to one person at the same time, everyone understood what it meant. That evening, in the back room of the restaurant on Penn Street, Cormac sent everyone home except one man. Niall Brennan stood across the table with both hands clasped behind his back, in the same posture he had maintained for all those years. Did you do it? Cormac asked. I did. I said it wasn't to be touched. You said you wouldn't touch it, Niall replied. You didn't say I couldn't. Cormac didn't answer. He sat in his chair, placed both hands on the table, and remained silent. That silence lasted longer than any reprimand could have, and Niall knew it well because he had stood in this room and watched it happen to other people many times before. You owe her your life, Niall said. You don't owe her the way you run things. Still, Cormac said nothing. People are talking, Cormac. Niall's voice changed. It dropped lower, no longer the voice of a subordinate, but that of a man who had walked beside another for too long to maintain any distance between them. Not loudly, only in whispers, but they're talking. They say you came back from the hospital different. They say a girl who bakes bread told you to stop, and you actually stopped. You know what happens to a man once people start saying he has gone soft? I do, Cormac said. He looked up. I also know what happens to a man who never allows himself to soften. I've lived with that longer than you realize. He rose, walked to the window, and stood with his back turned. You're going to the warehouse out in Braddock, he said. Starting Monday. You keep your salary. You keep everything. You oversee the warehouse. Niall didn't move. And here? You don't need to come here anymore. The same goes for every meeting. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall remained in the room. Wouldn't it be kinder to simply throw me out and be done with it? Niall asked. His voice didn't rise, but something inside it had just broken. It would be kinder to kill me. I know, Cormac said. He turned around. Listen carefully because I'm only going to say this once. If I throw you out, I'm declaring to everyone that you were wrong. But you weren't wrong because of greed, and you weren't wrong because you betrayed me. You were wrong because you thought I needed something, and you acted in my place. In all these years, you have never done anything for yourself. I know that. I won't let your name be held up as the name of a traitor, because you aren't one. He walked forward and stopped one step away from Niall. So you stay. You just aren't allowed near me anymore. That is the difference. Because of a promise to a stranger. Because I gave my word, Cormac said. If my word means something only when keeping it is convenient for me, then for the past 20 years, you've been following a liar. Is that what you want? Niall didn't answer. He remained there for another moment, then nodded once, very slowly. He reached into his pocket, removed the set of keys to this room, and placed them on the table. He didn't throw them or slam them down. He simply set them there. Then he walked out. Cormac didn't watch him leave. He stood alone for a very long time in the room, with its long table, a set of keys resting at its center, and no one else remaining. That Sunday morning, Sadie went downstairs to open the back door as she always did, and she heard the people outside before she saw anything. It wasn't noise. It was the steady murmur of a great many people standing close together and speaking quietly. She walked around to the front, unlatched the glass door, and froze. The line began at the bakery steps, stretched along the sidewalk, crossed the intersection, turned the corner to the west, and disappeared down the slope beyond where she could see. People stood in pairs and groups. Some held cups of coffee, some wore work boots, and some wore the uniform coats of the docks. No one was loud. No one raised a phone. They simply stood there in line and waited. Ruth came out of the kitchen, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked outside for exactly 1 second. Then she turned around and switched on every oven. It had begun with the longshoremen's union at the harbor. Someone on the executive board had read the article and shared it on their page with a single line saying that she kept records, and we should keep records too. That was all. But the union had hundreds of members, and most of those hundreds had, at one time or another, looked at their paychecks and known for certain that money was missing, and every one of them had decided not to say anything. That single line hadn't called on anyone to go anywhere. It had simply turned the story of one woman who baked bread into their own story. People bought bread. Everyone who entered bought something, most of them only one loaf, and every person reached across the counter to shake her hand before leaving. Some said a few words. Others said nothing at all. The first was a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands and a heavy coat, the smell of machine oil still clinging to him. He shook her hand and said he had driven down from up north while it was still dark, and his wife had told him he was crazy, and he had told her that she was probably right. Then he took his loaf and walked out. Around the middle of the morning, an elderly woman arrived, small and leaning on a cane, with someone behind her helping her along. She didn't buy bread immediately. She took Sadie's hand between both of hers and held it there. "My daughter is somewhere out there too," she said. "I haven't known where she is for a very long time." She looked up into Sadie's face. "I only wanted to see what someone's daughter looks like when, at last, someone is willing to see her." Then she released Sadie's hand, bought a loaf, and left. Near noon, when only a scattering of loaves remained on the trays, an elderly man came in with his granddaughter, a little girl about 5 or 6 years old. He lifted her until she was level with the counter, and Ruth handed her a loaf of brown bread, almost as large as she was. The child wrapped both arms around it, her face nearly hidden behind the loaf, and burst into laughter because the bread was still warm. The elderly man looked at his granddaughter, then at Sadie. "I wanted her to see this once in her life," he said. "That's all." The bread was gone before noon. Ruth returned to the ovens and didn't leave the kitchen until late that evening, baking one batch after another, her face flushed from the heat, her sleeves rolled high, without saying a single word. In all its years, the bakery had never opened on a Sunday. When the last customer had walked out and Sadie locked the door, she stood behind the counter for a while. Then she went into the cold storage room behind the kitchen and closed the door behind her. It was dark and quiet inside, with only the steady hum of the compressor. She stood there gripping the edge of a steel shelf with both hands, and she waited. She knew what was rising inside her chest. She had felt it all morning, each time another hand reached out toward hers. She lowered her head and waited for it to come, but it didn't. It rose as far as her throat and stopped there, unable to go any farther. She remained in the cold room for about 3 minutes, her hands still gripping the shelf, unable to cry. It had been too long since she had allowed herself to do that, so long that her body had forgotten how. He came that evening. She opened the door for him and asked before he had even stepped fully inside. "You did this, didn't you?" Cormac stood in the doorway. "No, that union is under your control. Everyone knows it." "Yes," he said, "and I could have done it. I sat looking at my phone for a very long time." He looked at her. "Then I remembered that you had told me not to." Curtis Nagy was an inspector with the State Labor Department, a man of average height with thinning hair, carrying a worn leather briefcase stuffed with so many papers that the clasp wouldn't close. He arranged to meet Sadie at a coffee shop near his office, and he arrived before she did, with the documents already spread across the table. He told her the investigation was no longer hers alone. Since the article had been published, more people had come forward, and by now, the number had grown far beyond anything he had expected when he opened the case. The earliest of them had worked there many years before, back when the shop hadn't yet begun staying open all night. And when he put the list together, one thing became unmistakably clear. One person had just left a shelter. Another had just been released from prison. Someone else had lost their identification and was waiting for replacements. Another couldn't speak enough English to read a pay stub. None of them had anywhere to file a complaint, and more importantly, none of them believed a complaint would accomplish anything. "That isn't a coincidence," Nagy said. "People don't hire at random and simply get lucky enough to find only workers who are afraid to speak. They choose them." Sadie sat quietly. Then she asked him exactly one question. "What about the others?" Nagy glanced up at her as though he had been expecting a different question. "They'll receive what they're owed too," he said, "if this is carried through to the end." He turned to another set of papers, her personal file, which he had been required to collect to complete the procedure, and skimmed the section concerning her debt. Then he stopped. He read it again. You never applied for innocent spouse relief? Sadie looked at him. For what? Nagy set down his pen. He explained it slowly, in the language of someone accustomed to explaining the law to people who had never studied it. When one spouse opened loans and credit accounts in the other spouse's name, without their knowledge, the law provided a door through which the innocent spouse could walk free. That door had existed for a long time, longer than she had carried the debt on her back. It required documents, time, and someone to guide her, but it was real. Sadie sat there and listened. Through all those years, she had stood before countless counters, spoken to countless people wearing name badges, and signed countless forms. Not one of them had ever said the words this man had spoken in less than a minute. Money wasn't what you lacked, Nagy said, and there was no harshness in his voice, only weariness. You lacked someone willing to tell you that door existed. Then he closed the file and told her the second thing. Dale Ferris had hired an attorney and requested an in-person hearing instead of settling the matter through written proceedings. May 14th. Nagy looked directly at her as he delivered the rest. I need to warn you. His attorney won't argue about the payroll records because they'll lose on the payroll records. They'll argue about you. They'll read your old record aloud in that room. They'll use that exact word. And all the others will be sitting in the back row listening. He paused. If you don't appear, you'll still receive your share. But the others won't. 2 weeks later, a woman named Margot Sandoval called and invited her to speak with a group of women who had recently left the shelter. Sadie went, but she didn't stand at the front. She pulled over a chair and sat in the circle with them. She told them the parts that weren't beautiful. She told them about scraping ice from the inside of her car windshield. She told them about the mornings she spent in the library, completing applications for places she already knew would never call her back. She told them about the night she had almost torn up the piece of paper. A woman around 40 sitting across from her asked whether she was angry. Yes, Sadie said. For a very long time. I was so angry that some mornings I woke up and the anger was the first thing in my mind, even before I remembered where I was lying. She looked down at her hands. Then one day, I sat down and added it up. That anger didn't pay my rent. It didn't cook a single meal for me. It didn't make any of them apologize. It only kept eating away at the part of me I needed in order to stand up. So I put it down. Not because I forgave them. I simply didn't have the strength to carry both. At the end of the gathering, after almost everyone had left, a very young woman lingered by the door, with her coat already on, and her hat in her hand, but she didn't leave. Everywhere I go, people call me sweetheart, the young woman said, her eyes fixed on the floor. Everywhere. I can't remember the last time anyone called me by my real name. Sadie didn't answer immediately. She allowed the words to remain in the room for several seconds because they deserved that much. Then she said, Tessa. The young woman nodded once, quickly and tightly, then walked out. At the end of April, he was admitted to the hospital for a second time. This time, it didn't happen on a sidewalk, and there was no crowd gathered around him. One afternoon, he felt a tightness in his chest, and they took him in before it could become anything worse. The person who called Sadie wasn't from the hospital. It was an unfamiliar number, a man's voice, brief and direct, telling her that someone wanted to see her and that a car would be sent if she agreed. She went. He was on the top floor, beyond the same corridor that required a badge to be swiped twice before anyone could enter. He was awake, his face slightly gray, and when she walked in, he didn't thank her for coming. He merely tipped his chin toward the monitor beside the bed. Can you read that? Yes. Then read it. He looked at her. I don't need anyone to comfort me. I need someone who knows what she's looking at and has nothing to gain from any of this. They're telling me everything is fine. I want to know whether they're hiding something. Sadie walked over to the monitor. She read every line slowly, the way her hands and eyes had done for so many years in other rooms. She studied the rhythm, the oxygen saturation, and the small graph moving across the screen. She also examined the medication chart hanging at the foot of the bed. Then she turned back to him. No one is hiding anything from you, she said. These numbers really are stable. If they intended to hide something, they would have had to change that medication chart too, and the medications match what they've told you. She pulled over a chair and sat down. No one is deceiving you. You're afraid. People often confuse those two things. especially people who have spent their entire lives unaccustomed to fearing anything. He didn't answer. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. The following afternoon, the doctor came in. She was the same woman who had signed his discharge papers the first time, and now she carried a folder of test results. She explained that what had happened to him wasn't caused by overwork, stress, or anything he could change by living differently. It was a disease of the heart muscle, carried in the blood and inherited, and in many people, it remained silent for decades before speaking only once. She asked whether anyone else in his family had experienced the same thing. Cormac said his father had. He told her that his father had collapsed in the backyard when Cormac was a child, and at the time, they had simply recorded the cause as heart failure and said nothing more. The doctor nodded. She said that was precisely the kind of family history she was asking about. Then she asked whether there had been anyone else. Cormac was silent for a moment before saying he had a sister. He said she had died long ago, during the winter, outside. The doctor's pen stopped. She said she wasn't permitted to draw any conclusions about someone she had never examined, and she made that clear before continuing. But she also said that in a family carrying this condition in its blood, when a young person was found in circumstances like those, the cause was often recorded as exposure to the cold because the cold was something people could see. The other thing couldn't be seen, and many times, the cold wasn't what happened first. When she finished, she thanked him and left. Only the sound of the machines remained in the room. Cormac lay still for a very long time. Sadie sat beside him without speaking, because she had learned long ago that there were moments when words weren't what a person needed. Then he turned his head toward her, and when he spoke, his voice had grown hoarse. "So I've hated this entire city for all these years," he said, "because of something no one did." The person who called her was a man around 50, his voice hesitant as he introduced himself as Mrs. Halloway's son. He said he had read the article and had spent several weeks trying to decide whether to find her number. He said his mother was still alive, still there, in room 214. He said there was something he needed to tell her, but he didn't want to say it over the telephone. Sadie drove there one afternoon in May. She stood in the parking lot, looking up at the building for a long time before going inside. During all those months she had slept in her car. She had passed this place more times than she could count, because the bus stop where she often waited was only a few dozen steps from the main entrance. She had never once gone in. Nothing inside had changed. The same light, the same smell, disinfectant mingled with laundered fabric and the scent of the evening meal being served early. She walked along the corridor she had crossed thousands of times during her old night shifts, and her feet remembered the way before her mind did. Mrs. Halloway's son was waiting near the room. He held a document envelope in his hands. He began telling her before she had time to ask. No one had ever taken the ring. His mother had hidden it herself. Her memory had begun slipping away from her even then, though no one had yet given it a name, and she had placed the ring somewhere and forgotten where. They found it several months later while replacing the furnishings in her room. He said the facility knew. He said he knew for certain that they knew because he had been there that day, but no one called Sadie. Calling her would have meant admitting they had been wrong, and by then, that line had already been entered into her state record. Sadie stood with one hand resting on the back of a chair in the corridor. She said nothing. Then he held out the envelope. Inside were 3 letters. The first had been written long ago in his handwriting, but in his mother's words, a long and coherent letter asking the administration to invite Sadie back to work and making clear that Mrs. Halloway had hidden the ring herself. The second was shorter and had been written several years later. The third contained only one sentence. All 3 bore the office's receipt stamp. All 3 had been placed in the internal file. None had ever been sent anywhere. "My mother made me write them," he said. 3 times. I wrote them. I submitted them. Then I stopped asking too. Sadie pushed open the door to room 214. Mrs. Halloway lay on her side, far smaller than Sadie remembered, her hair completely white, her eyes open and facing the window. She turned when Sadie entered and looked at her. There was nothing in that gaze. She didn't recognize her. Sadie pulled over a chair and sat beside the bed. The comb was still on the bedside cabinet, the wooden one with wide teeth that Mrs. Halloway had used years before. Sadie picked it up. She didn't think. Her hands simply moved on their own. She gently lifted the woman's head, slipped one hand beneath the back of her neck for support, and began to comb, moving outward from the roots, one lock at a time, slowly, exactly as she had done every Tuesday night through all those years. Mrs. Holloway closed her eyes. Then she spoke very softly, without looking at anyone, in the voice of someone drifting into sleep. She called out a name. It wasn't Sadie's. Sadie's hand stopped midway through a stroke. From the doorway, her son said quietly, "That was what my mother called you the entire time you worked here. Everyone in our family knew." He paused. "My sister died a very long time ago, when I was still a child." Sadie remained still. "My mother didn't remember your name," he said. "By the time she made me write the third letter, she didn't remember mine either, but she remembered that someone combed her hair every Tuesday night, and she knew with absolute certainty that person wasn't a thief." Sadie finished combing her hair. She continued until every strand lay smooth, then returned the comb to its place on the cabinet. She pulled the blanket up across Mrs. Holloway's chest and smoothed the edge until it lay straight, exactly as she had done in the past. The old woman was asleep. Sadie switched off the small lamp on the wall. Then she stood, left the room, walked the length of the corridor, crossed the lobby, pushed through the doors, and made her way across the parking lot to her car. She opened the door, sat down, and closed it behind her. Then she collapsed. She folded over the steering wheel and cried, holding nothing back. No sound came during the first few seconds, and then it did. All those years. The thing inside her chest that had remained sealed for so long that her body had forgotten how to open it finally broke open in an empty parking lot, outside a building she had passed hundreds of times without ever stepping inside. 3 nights before the hearing, Sadie went down to the kitchen, close to 4 o'clock in the morning, just as she did every day. Ruth had told her to take those few days off, and she had said no. She needed the familiar rhythm more than she needed sleep. She was weighing flour when she saw a figure outside the glass front door. Dale Ferris stood beneath the streetlight without a hat, his coat unbuttoned, unsteady on his feet. He didn't look like the man who used to stand behind the cash register without daring to raise his eyes. He looked like someone who had lost everything and had only just begun to understand it. He struck the glass with the flat of his hand. She didn't open the door. She stood several steps away, still holding the scoop she had been using to weigh the flour. He began to speak, loudly, his voice breaking from the cold and from something else. He asked whether she knew whom he owed. He said the shop had never truly belonged to him. It was the place where he kept money moving, so he could pay people every month. That was why it stayed open all night. That was why he paid people by hand. Everything he had done through all those years had been only to keep that circle turning. He said that when those records were exposed, he didn't merely lose the shop. He lost his only means of staying alive. Then he pointed at her through the glass. "That morning, I told you to stand up because I was trying to save you," he shouted. "You think I was afraid of being sued? Do you have any idea whose chest you were pressing?" Sadie remained still. "The chest of someone who needed CPR," she said. He stared at her through the glass for another moment. Then he swung his arm. The glass shattered. It broke into large sheets that fell inward, and the sound filled the entire kitchen for 1 second. No one was hurt. Ferris remained outside with his arm still raised, breathing hard, making no move to step inside. And the only thing Sadie did in that moment, before she even had time to think, was turn, reach toward the shelf behind her, take the glass jar containing the bakery's sourdough starter, and hold it against her chest. Her phone was in the pocket of her apron. Inside that phone was a number she needed to press only once. She knew perfectly well that if she called it, someone would arrive within 40 minutes, and afterward, she would never have to think about the man standing outside again. Never again, in any sense of the word. She took out her phone and called 911. She gave the address, said a man had just broken the glass door, said he was still outside, and said no one had been hurt. Then she called Curtis Nagy and left a voicemail. After that, she sat on a wooden chair amid the broken glass, the jar of starter still cradled in her lap, and waited. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. Ferris didn't resist. He sat on the front step and allowed them to do their work. Ruth arrived as the sky was beginning to brighten. She looked at the door, looked at Sadie, then walked straight into the kitchen, turned on the ovens, and began preparing the first batch, as though this were an ordinary day. Cormac arrived after the police car had gone. He looked at the empty doorframe, at the boards that had been fastened over it temporarily, then at her. "Why didn't you call me?" he asked. "Because if I called you once," she said, "I would call you again the next time, then again after that, and I would never know whether I could stand on my own." He was silent for a moment. I pulled everyone away, he said. Because you told me to. Do you know how I'm supposed to sit with what happened tonight? Sadie looked at him. Yes, she said. The same way I have to live with everything I decide for myself. Welcome. He didn't answer. He remained there for another moment, looking into the kitchen where Ruth worked beneath the lights. Then he left. The following morning, when Sadie went to open the back door, a paper envelope was lying on the step. It had no stamp, no address, and no name. She picked it up and opened it right there. Inside was her hardbound notebook, without a single page missing. Alongside it was a small piece of paper bearing a heavy handwritten message, in the script of someone unaccustomed to holding a pen. 4 words. I made a mistake. Beneath them were 2 initials. The hearing room was on the 3rd floor of an administrative building, smaller than Sadie had imagined, with only a few rows of wooden chairs and a long table at the front. Everyone who had once worked for Dale Ferris sat in the back rows. One person wore a borrowed shirt. Another sat with a straight back and didn't dare look around. Someone had brought a number written on a piece of paper folded into quarters, because that was all they had. Ferris sat on the other side with his attorney, a young man with neatly combed hair and papers arranged in 3 stacks. He began exactly as Nagy had warned. He didn't say a single word about the payroll records. He picked up a sheet of paper, asked permission to read it into the record, and read Sadie's old file aloud. He included the note in the state registry. He read slowly, pronouncing every word clearly, and he used that exact word, theft. Then he looked up and asked whether she was seeking revenge against the man who had given her a job when no one else would. The entire room fell silent. Sadie sat straight. She didn't object. She didn't say she was innocent. Go ahead and read all of it, she said. Read it aloud. Read it a second time if you want. I've lived with those words far longer than you've held that paper in your hand, so you can't frighten me with something I carry every day. She turned and looked toward the back rows, then faced forward again. But we aren't sitting here today because of me. We're here because of the people sitting behind me. Ask them whether any of them kept records. Not one did. It wasn't because they were stupid. It was because they had just left a shelter, had just been released from prison, or had just lost their identification. They needed that job more than they needed anything else in the world. She looked directly at the attorney. And that is exactly why they were chosen. I was simply the only one among them who happened to have a habit of keeping records. If I hadn't had that habit, you would have won today. The attorney opened his mouth to continue, but the door to the room opened. Mrs. Holloway's son entered carrying a file, accompanied by a woman Sadie would later learn was his family's attorney. He apologized for being late. He said he had read the article the previous month and had emailed the newspaper that same evening. Hal Merrick had forwarded the message to Curtis Nagy. Nagy had contacted him, and they had spent several weeks obtaining certified copies of the nursing home records. He placed the 3 letters bearing the office's receipt stamps on the table, and beside them, he placed the report recording the date the ring had been found in the room, along with the signatures of the 2 employees who had been present that day. No one in the room spoke. Ferris's attorney bent over the documents and read. At first, he read very quickly. Then he began reading more slowly. Finally, he sat upright and stopped reading altogether. Everything he had built during the previous 15 minutes collapsed in less than 1 minute. And he knew it before the hearing officer had time to speak again. The rest of the morning concerned only working hours and payroll records, and that was the part the other side had always known it would lose. As everyone began to rise, Nagy approached Sadie with the leather briefcase that wouldn't close tucked beneath his arm. I knew about those letters 3 weeks ago, he said. Sadie turned toward him. Why didn't you tell me? Because if I had, Nagy replied, you would have walked in here this morning holding a card in your hand, and people would have heard it in your voice. I needed you to walk into this room with nothing in your hands except your truth. He looked at her. That is exactly what you did. He nodded once, then walked toward the clerk's table. Sadie remained alone between the 2 rows of chairs. Then she turned and looked toward the back of the room. In the last row, beside the door, a man in a black wool coat was sitting alone. He held nothing in his hands. He spoke to no one. Not a single person in the room greeted him, and he greeted no one. Throughout the entire morning, he hadn't risen, hadn't intervened, and hadn't allowed anyone to know he was there. He had simply come and sat. When she saw him, he didn't nod, smile, or make any gesture at all. He merely held her gaze for one brief moment, then stood and left before everyone else. He came to the bakery one afternoon in June, and for the first time, no one stood outside the door, and no car was parked across the sidewalk. He sat in the wooden chair beside the steel table and told her something he had never told anyone. He said that through all those years, every Tuesday morning, he instructed his driver to park 2 blocks away, then walked the final stretch alone because it was the last road his sister had ever walked. He said he stood on that corner for about 15 minutes before turning back, every week without fail, and no one in his world knew where he went on Tuesday mornings. That morning, he had been walking back toward the car when he collapsed only a few steps away from it. Then he took an old photograph from his coat pocket, its edges worn, and placed it on the table. Sadie picked it up. She studied it for a long time. The woman in the photograph was young, with red hair, laughing with her head tilted to one side. And somewhere in Sadie's mind, a door opened onto a place very far away. When she was 15, she often went with her mother to a church down the street on Friday evenings to hand out bread. A woman with red hair always sat at the last table. She never gave her name and always asked for one extra loaf to take with her. And every time she rose to leave, she left a paper napkin folded into the shape of a crane on the table. Sadie told him that detail. Cormac didn't answer. He stood, walked to the window, turned his back to her, and remained there for a very long time, unable to speak. Then he said in a hoarse voice that his mother had taught his sister how to fold those cranes when she was very small. He said that for 2 years, he had believed his sister was living out there without a single person in the world. It turned out that someone had kept her fed. Sadie set the photograph down. She said she didn't remember his sister. She said hundreds of people had passed that table every Friday night through all those years, and she couldn't remember a single face. Then she told him what she truly wanted him to understand. She wasn't special. Things like that happened far more often than he imagined. All across the city, every day, in kitchens, churches, and corridors where no one was there to take a photograph. He simply hadn't been there to see them. That summer, the note beside her name in the state registry was removed and replaced with a brief statement declaring that no misconduct had occurred. The compensation reached her account at the end of the month, and she gave most of it to Margot Sandoval's program, keeping only enough for the deposit on an apartment. She didn't tell anyone. Ruth found out only because Margot called to thank her and accidentally dialed the bakery's number. The following day, Ruth placed the glass jar of sourdough starter in front of her, the starter that hadn't left that building since her grandmother's time. She told Sadie to feed it every morning. If it died, it was gone, and there was nowhere she could buy another. Sadie asked why she was giving it to her. "Because you're the only person I've ever hired who understands that some things stay alive only when someone decides every day to keep them alive," Ruth said, then turned away before Sadie could say anything more. That afternoon, Cormac turned back at the door. He said she hadn't merely saved his life. She had answered a question he had carried through all those years, whether the world ever stopped for someone who had nothing left. He said that once she had a clean name and an address of her own, he wanted to invite her for a cup of coffee, not as the person who had saved him, but simply as herself. Sadie told him she already had both. And for the first time in this entire story, Cormac Fallon smiled. The apartment with 1 bedroom in Bloomfield had a window overlooking a quiet street, and in the afternoons, the sound of children playing on the sidewalk drifted upward, the most ordinary sound in the world, one she hadn't heard from inside a home of her own in many years. On Monday morning, Tessa Doyle entered the bakery for her first shift, and the only thing Sadie said as the young woman stood in the doorway was, "Wash your hands, Tessa." This story leaves us with several very simple truths. A person's dignity isn't found in a bank account, but in what they choose to do when doing it costs them something. Never allow an unproven accusation to become someone's life sentence, because one anonymous line can steal an entire life. Helping someone the right way doesn't mean carrying them. It means opening a door, then stepping back so they can walk through it on their own feet. And kindness is never lost. It simply travels in a circle, sometimes for a very long time, before returning when we least expect it. One afternoon, Sadie locked the bakery and walked home to her apartment, passing the exact place on the sidewalk where everything had begun. The ice had melted long ago. She didn't stop. She didn't need to stop anymore. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue listening to more meaningful stories every day. How did Sadie's story make you feel? And what would you have chosen in her place? Please leave a comment below because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from the depths of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.